morning. Welcome to Library Adventures Live. Now, my name is Linda, and this is my second session of LAL. I'm one of a team of 12 librarians who look after all the libraries in Kirklees. It's a great job, and taking turns to deliver this session is one of the best bits. Each week we have different adventures. There are authors reading from their work and answering your questions, illustrators running draw-alongs and sketching your suggestions, and lots of creative activities for you to do. If you've missed any of the sessions, you can still catch up on YouTube and Facebook. Visit our website. Let's find the banners bit. There we go. So if you visit our website, there we are, kirkleeslibraries.co.uk/LAL, and you'll be able to have all the catch-up ones there. And if you or your parents or your teachers, that's if you're watching at school, have any questions or comments or any suggestions about LAL, just email us. There you go, lal.kirklees.gov.uk, and one of the Children's Reader Development team will get back to you. Now, last week we met Nadine Cardan. Nadine is originally from Syria, and since the age of 8, Nadine hasn't stopped writing and illustrating children's books. She said she simply knew that this was what she wanted to do with her life. She started sharing her fairy stories with her 5th grade classmates, and 20 years later on, she's an award-winning children's book author and illustrator. Nadine writes about the rich culture and proud history of Damascus and the courage of the Syrian children. She read her book Tomorrow, A Story of Syria, and she read the book twice. Firstly, she read it in Arabic, that's her first language, and then in English. She can actually speak 4 different languages. Nadine created all the beautiful illustrations herself and showed us how to draw her characters. So if you haven't seen that one, go and have a look at it because it was really good. Now, since I last spoke to you, we now have 17 of our libraries open for safe borrowing. And they have reduced hours, so it's best to speak to our people, give them a ring, 01484 414 868. And that's the number that you can speak to our people. They'll tell you what you have to do to get back to safely visiting our libraries. And we've all been very busy buying new books for you to choose from. Now, whilst the libraries were closed, we librarians were still busy. We were choosing books from for our online ebook and e-audio collection. And this is from Overdrive. And all you need to do is download the Libby app. There's even a YouTube video to show you how to do this. So if you get stuck, just get in touch with us. Now, this week, I'm talking to Ross MacKenzie. So please use the chat if you have any questions for us, and then I can ask them as I go along. But firstly, I'd like to ask if we have any schools out there, because I'm hoping that some of the class visits, some of the classes have been able to join us today. So I'm going to put the comments on, and if you have, if you're joining us from a school, if you could just let us know, because Ross would really like to interact with some children and get some questions from the children. I've got some questions, but it'd be nice if we could have some children's questions as well. So I'll put the comments on and see what we've got. I'm going to leave that up so that I can see if we've got any schools coming in. Okay, so back to Ross. Now, Ross is a multi-award-winning author of the Nowhere Emporium, the Elsewhere Emporium, and now the latest in that trilogy is called the Otherwhere Emporium. All emporiums. The Nowhere Emporium won numerous awards, including the Blue Peter Book Award and the Scottish Children's Book Award. He's also written another book called Shadowsmith, and the wonderful one that we're going to talk about today, which is Evernight. This is the book that we're going to talk about. Now, Ross lives in Renfrewshire in Scotland, but he spends much of his time in other worlds. He creates all these wonderful other worlds. So I'd like to welcome Ross to the studio, and he's going to spend the rest of the hour talking to us about his book. So there, now we've got Ross on the screen. Hi, Ross.
Hi.
Bit of a bumpy start, but there we are. We're okay.
No,
Okay, so the Evernight book, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I couldn't put it down. It's so very exciting. It's full of magic. It's got mystery. It's got humour, but there's some dark and dangerous bits in there as well. So perhaps could I ask you to start by just giving us a bit of a brief introduction to this murky world that is Kingshaven?
Certainly, absolutely. Thank you, Linda, for the kind words about the book. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I love it. I just love it.
Good. I'm so glad, and I hope that anyone else out there who decides to read it enjoys it too. So, yeah, Evernight. Evernight. See, I suppose I should probably start things off by telling you that I'm a bit of a history geek. I like reading about our past, and one of the time periods that fascinates me most is the Victorian era, specifically Victorian London, because that's probably the most famous sort of, you have all those great Charles Dickens novels and all that set in and round about Victorian London. So I just think there's this magic round the Victorian era. It was, when you really think about it in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't that long ago, but the world was vastly different. There were no cars, no internet, no telephone for the most part, no electricity for a huge part of it. And Victorian London was just this magical place, filled with dark, shadowy corners where dangerous things would happen, and filled with characters too. So with that in mind, I wanted to write a book that took in the flavours of that sort of Victorian era of London, but I wanted to create my own world, my own city. I wanted there to be magic involved. So the thing that really sparked it was, I was reading one day about some of the jobs that people did in Victorian London, what they called the lower classes back then, the people who lived in the slums, and there would often be, like 15, 20 people sharing just a couple of rooms, all living on top of each other, and it was rife with, crime and disease, and really, really tough way to live. But one of the fascinating things was the jobs that people did out of desperation to put money and food on the table. So you had things, really famous ones like chimney sweeps, and you had mudlarks who would go out onto the mud of the Thames when the tide was out, and they would search through the mud for things that had been dropped off of ships or washed out of the sewers. You had pickpockets, you had all these different things, but the one that really caught my imagination was there was this group of people who were known as toshers, Tosher, tosher. And if that was your job, what you would do, and this could be, children as young as 8, 9, 10 years old, they would every day go into the sewers. They would delve into the sewers armed only with a gas lamp, and they would hunt through the sewers for treasure, because Victorians built the sewers under London, the modern sewer system, and they built them out of brick. They're really quite, it's going to sound strange, but they're really quite beautiful places, these brick tunnels underground. And because they're made of brick, the water wears the bricks away and the mortar between the bricks, and it creates cracks and fissures into which things can become lodged. So, Linda, for instance, if you're a Victorian, and you are walking along the street and you think to yourself, oh, I'm hungry, I'm going to buy myself a bag of chestnuts from that chestnut stall there. You maybe go into your purse and you bring a coin out, maybe you drop that coin, clink onto the street, rolls along the street, clink, 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 down the drain, into the sewer stream, and there it would become lodged into one of these fissures. And that is what a tosher would do. They would find lost treasure under the streets of London.
I can't imagine having to walk about in the sewers in London.
I know. And it was just a daily occurrence for these people. They were really brave and they were experts. They knew every twist and turn and dip of these sewer tunnels. And so I wanted, as soon as I knew that was a real thing, a real job, I knew I had to write about it. And I knew I wanted my world to be magical. I knew I wanted there to be witches and spells and all sorts of things. And so I started to create the Silver Kingdom. I started to create the city of Kingshaven, which is a sort of mashup of mostly Victorian London, but a few bits and pieces from Barcelona, which is one of my other favourite cities. And I just wanted to create this new world with this real Victorian flavour to it. And there are sort of steampunky elements to it. We have clockwork horses run by spells. We have, just all sorts of wonderful things all mixed together. So it's a recipe that really tasted right in my head, if that makes sense.
Well, that takes care of the next question then, because I was going to
Oh,
ask, how did you come up with the ideas for the book? So I can understand how you would be interested in all this, but then to add your bits to it and make it come
yeah,
alive,
yeah,
that's the exciting bit. And when I first read it, I knew nothing about toshers. So to hear you
mhm,
explain what they had to do, I can't.
mhm,
I do know about chimney sweeps, and I know about
yeah,
children that had to go down mines and things to
yeah,
earn a living. But
mhm,
I can't imagine groveling around in these. I'm sure they're beautiful if they're clean and lovely to go
yeah,
looking around in if you wanted a day out, but not when they were
mhm.
being used as sewers. I don't think,
Yeah,
especially not in Victorian times.
yeah, exactly.
Um,
And there were so many, legends and stories around the sewers too. There were tales of strange creatures that um, there were tales of rats the size of dogs. There was like
oh
tales
my
of like,
goodness!
the sewer, just strange creatures. Maybe people had kept pets that had escaped, and then there were rumored to be monsters in there, and it was really dangerous too. Because if you can imagine down there, there's going to be things like gas buildups and stuff like that. And if you were down there with a lamp, a flame
Yeah,
lamp, and you took the wrong turn, then kaboom, that was it. So it was a dangerous job. And but I just thought there was something really, really sort of um, I don't know. I guess it wouldn't leave me alone. This idea, this thought that these brave souls were going down there into the dark, and their lamps were pushing back the darkness, and they were searching for treasure. And then I just thought, well, what would happen if someone found something that had been lost for a long time down there? Um, and I wanted this world to have witches, to have magic. And I thought, well, maybe one of these toshers finds something that is very important to this magical community of witches, which has been gone for a long time. And what if that kickstarts this whole series of events? And that's when the idea really started to sort of snowball and gain a bit of traction.
I think we might have whetted everybody's appetite for it now.
I hope so.
Would it be okay to ask you to read a little bit
I'd love to. I'd love
from
to.
Evernight? Thank you.
Yes, no problem. So, what I would like to do now, just to give you a little taste of what we were just talking about, the sewers, is read you chapter 2, which is called Beneath the Streets. And in this chapter, we meet our hero, Lara Bell Fox, for the first time. And Lara is probably the most, I think she is the best tosher, the best sewer treasure hunter in all of the huge city of Kingshaven. So we meet Lara for the first time here, and we see her going about her daily business under the streets. Lara Bell Fox was sheltering in the tunnels beneath the city when she heard a commotion. She almost didn't notice, such was the great cacophony of rain and wind and rushing water barreling through the darkened sewers. Rivers of rain had fed the stream, leaving many of the tunnels inaccessible. Fierce water rumbled past her feet, splashing her wax-coated boots, gurgling and foaming, carrying twigs and leaves and drowned rats and cats. Lara's eyes were sharp and alert, and they flicked here and there and all about, watching the water as it passed through the golden light from the dragon breath lamp tied around her neck. Her muddled reflection stared back at her from the rough surface, 13 years old and brown-skinned and fiercely focused. She was hoping to glimpse shining things in the waters, coins or lost jewellery. But it was not a treasure that caught her attention now. It was the sound of an argument. Lara extinguished her lamp at once, and crushing darkness folded in on top of her. A newcomer to those tunnels would have been instantly lost, disoriented, panic-stricken. Not Lara. Lara breathed deep and stayed calm. She knew every twist and turn and dip of the sewers in the same easy, natural way a small child might know the rhythms of a nursery rhyme. Creeping forward, she followed the voices, the sound of her footsteps smothered by the stream. Around a bend she went to an intersection where several sewers met. Light spilled from an adjacent tunnel, and Lara slowed, crouching low against the smooth, cold brick. She peeked around the corner. There were 5 of them. 5 boys. Each was dressed in a tosher's things, a wax-coated jacket and boots and gloves, with a dragon breath lamp hanging around his neck. 4 of the boys were large, almost men, but the fifth was younger and much smaller. The 4 larger boys had formed a circle around the smaller one. Lara knew him very well, for she had taught him the ways of toshing herself. His name was Joe Littlefoot, and he was looking around at the others with fierce, frightened green eyes. "It's mine!" His hand hovered protectively on the toshing bag slung over his shoulder. "I found this stuff fair and square. I'm not even on your patch." "Well, we've decided to expand," said one of the older boys. His head was pale and shaved, his voice gravelly from all the pipes he smoked. His name was Vin Cotton, and Lara knew about him and his gang and was wary of coming across them. "I reckon the tunnel running under Milk Street belongs to us now, which means the loot you find here is ours too." He pointed to the bag. "You can't just claim tunnels," cried Joe. "And who's going to stop us? You?" Lara bristled at this, felt her hackles rise. To be a tosher took guts and smarts and bravery, and Lara thought that Cotton had none of these things. He was a coward, a bully. "Last chance." Joe shook his head. I need whatever I can get. My granny, she needs looking after." Cotton held up a finger to quiet him. Then he brought a knife out from his coat and pushed the point of the blade against Joe's throat. Not enough to draw blood, but certainly enough to frighten Joe out of his wits. Lara almost cried out. "I don't give a hag's tongue about your granny. You need to learn a lesson in respect, sunshine." He nodded to the others. "Take everything he's got." They closed in. Thinking quick, Lara reached into her own toshing bag and brought out a bent metal spoon she'd found in the tunnels earlier. She stood up, reared back, and threw the spoon as far down the sewer as she could manage. It hit the wall with a clang, and Cotton and his gang spun around and held up their lamps. "Who's there?" "Run, Joe! Run!" Lara stepped into the light, and Joe's eyes grew wide. He broke into a sprint, his wax-coated boots splashing through the water towards her. Then they were away, twisting, turning through the tunnels, the stinking air filled with the curses and threats from Cotton and his chasing gang. And I think we should probably leave it there.
Now then, that's the bit that I found so exciting about your book. That just leads you in. You just want to be in there. You want to be saving Joe. You want to be. You're in those. I was in those dark tunnels, and what I want to ask about is the dragon breath lamp. I've just written it down here. Dragon breath lamp. What's a dragon breath lamp? How does that work?
Well,
it's a magical lamp.
Yes, yeah, in a way, yes. So, the lamps in Victorian London were the gas lamps, and you had these lamp lighters who would go around and light the lamps. That's how they we just take it for granted nowadays. The street lamps ping on at 7 o'clock now. We're getting into winter. But there were actually people who had to go around and light the lamps back in Victorian London. Armies of men who would go around the streets and light these lamps. So I knew that there were gas lamps out there, but I wanted another take on it, and I wanted something that would burn really bright, and I wanted something that would burn, I suppose, burn not forever, but for a long, long time. So dragon breath is a sort of fuel in this world, and as you would expect, it has to do with dragons. There are people out there. It's not in the books, but I know it in my head that there are people in the north usually who go and they find the places where dragons live, and they don't harm the dragons, but they kind of coax the. I've got this whole hunting thing, this whole sort of dragon breath capture thing in my head, where they'll go up in skyships and they will have the dragons chase them, and when the dragons breathe their fire, they will capture it, and then they will bring it back, and that's the fuel for these dragon breath lamps.
Dragon breath lamps. I think that's absolutely fantastic. I will be recommending your book to reluctant readers. I'm dyslexic, but I didn't find out I was dyslexic until I was a grown-up. And I love the way that each chapter is only short, and when it ends, it leaves you wanting to know more. So, like it's like watching a box set on TV. You just want to carry on watching the next episode, and when reading your book, you want to read the next chapter. I think that it's very something that I don't come across very much when I read children's books, but it's just the lovely way that at the end of each chapter, you want to read more, and it changes so quickly. Just as you think the story is going to be going all right, then you start the next chapter, and the villain appears, and it really keeps you in that story. It really keeps you. So I don't know whether that was what you wanted to achieve or not, but
Yeah,
it's an absolute winner for children who struggle to read, because it keeps you wanting to know more.
that is just, you just said magic words to me. That's like the thing every writer wants to hear. I think that they've written something that captures the attention of everyone, but specifically, if this book can capture the imagination or capture the attention of reluctant readers, or people who have had problems with dyslexia, or if it hooks them in, and it makes them want to read, then I've done my job, and it's just music to my ears that you say that. So
That's the amazing thing for me. I've tried, I read books sometimes and I think, oh yeah, okay, well I'll put it down now. I'll do this, I'll do that. But yours, I had to carry around. I had to find out what was going on next. I had to know. So congratulations on that. That's brilliant. Each chapter gives you part of the story, and each chapter introduces a different character, where they live, how they live, and then the book goes on to weave all the information together into a story. Now, do you have all the worlds and the characters already in your mind at the onset? And the question is, how on earth do you keep all that so skillfully in your mind and then roll it out so easily, so that the character, so that the reader can follow the story? And I suppose what I'm asking is about the process of
yeah,
writing the book.
yeah.
How do you have all those worlds, all those characters, and then let them out at the right time? How do you do that so skillfully?
Yeah, it gets a bit noisy in here sometimes. But I think I think it was Stephen King who I heard talking one time about, not to me personally, obviously, but I heard him on an interview saying that for him the writing process is like driving in the fog, where he knows, when you're driving in the fog, you can see just ahead of you to keep going, but
Yeah.
beyond that, you don't quite know what's there. And for me, that's what the writing process is like. I don't like to plan out every single little thing that's going to happen. For me, that works for some writers, and that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with doing that. Obviously, there's been some amazing books written and some fantastic writers who plan everything out to the last line. But for me, I've got to have some freedom. So I like to know certain points that I have to hit along the way. Like, I know Lara's got to get here, and Joe's got to get there, and at some point they'll meet up. But how that happens and the things that happen in between there, I like to let the characters take control, and I like there to be a bit of freedom about my writing. And I think that I think that I'm probably as a a consequence of that. I couldn't find that word there. Sorry. As a consequence of that, a happy consequence, that leads to these cliffhangers, because sometimes I don't know what's going to happen next. So I want to know myself, and if I can keep myself interested when I'm writing, then fingers crossed that I'll keep the readers interested too, if that makes sense.
That is really clever. That is, I was talking to an author who said that the book that she'd written, she had the person that she was writing, because it was a fiction book written about a non-fiction character. She said she felt that she had the character on her shoulder, driving the reading
Mm,
process
yeah,
along. And it
yeah,
sounds to me as though you've got Lara and Joe there,
yeah,
just
absolutely.
carrying the process forward with you. I think that is
Yeah,
that,
and
and that
for
does stand
anyone,
out.
yeah, yeah, thank you. And for anyone who writes, sorry, anyone who doesn't write, um, it's probably quite difficult to get your head around or wrap your mind around the fact that for an author, for me at least, and for some other authors I've spoken to, the characters that you write about, they aren't fictional. In your head they are real people, they have to be while you're writing about them. Otherwise, you're not going to care what happens to them. So they have to be real. And for me, that's a really good way of putting it. It's like having them sitting on your shoulder, and telling you what to do. Sometimes, and I say this when I go out to schools and we do writing workshops and stuff, and sometimes it gets me a few funny looks, but sometimes the characters will do something that you don't expect, which sounds really strange considering they come out of here. So how could they do something I don't expect? But sometimes when I'm writing, the characters will take a different turn than I was expecting. And obviously, on some level, I'm in control of that, but it feels like they're going off and doing something else. And sometimes it leads to the most amazing things that wouldn't happen otherwise in your book that you haven't planned for. And that's why I don't like to plan too much, because then you would miss out on those sort of natural sort of turns that the characters take, and they can take this. Don't get me wrong, sometimes I've taken these turns and it's a dead end and I waste a week and I've got to get rid of 10,000 words because it just isn't working. But there are times where it will take an unexpected turn and it will lead to something that I would never thought of, and it makes the book better and more exciting. So yeah, it's a really, that's what makes writing for me such an exciting job, is you never know what's going to happen next.
So when you were a child, did you read as a child?
I did. I wasn't a huge sort of reader until primary 5. I always liked, I was more, until that age, I was more of a comic book sort of child. I loved comic books, and I'm still to this day, I'm a very visual person. I trained as a graphic designer. I didn't go off to uni and study, English literature or creative writing. That was just all done through practice at home. I went and studied graphic design because I'm a very visual person. And I suppose when I was in high school, and I knew I wanted to be a writer, an author, but saying that you want to be an author when you're 16 or 17 is sort of like saying you want to be a footballer or a movie star. It's one of those dream jobs.
Yeah.
And usually the first thing people will say to you as well, trying to be nice, is, what's your plan B? Because, there's a big chance that's not going to happen. So my plan B was graphic design. And I went into that. So I knew that I was a very visual person. I liked to write comic books. I liked to read comic books. And then in primary 5 is when the spark was really lit in my head. And we had a teacher in primary 5 called Miss McLean, who I've learned has gone off to live in Canada now. So Miss McLean was brilliant. She was just an amazing, amazing teacher. And she was a fantastic storyteller. And just all the pieces came together, all the stars aligned correctly when I was in primary 5, because we had Miss McLean, and she loved to read to us aloud. She was the first teacher who read to us aloud on a regular basis, and really made a habit of, a couple of times a week for the last half hour of school. She would sit us down on the carpet around her desk, 30 kids, and she would read to us from whichever book we were covering at the time. And I will never forget it. It's ingrained into it's like tattooed onto the inside of my head. I can still see it really clearly. There was one sort of lovely spring Friday afternoon, and Miss McLean sat us down on the carpet, and she said to us, "We're going to start a new book today." And she pulled this book out her drawer in her desk, and it was The Witches by Roald Dahl.
Yeah.
And she started to read The Witches. And at the beginning of The Witches, I should know it off by heart by now because I've read it so many times, but there's a paragraph at the beginning which goes something along the lines of, in fairy tales, witches wear pointed hats and they have black cats and they ride on broomsticks. But this is not a story about fairy tale witches. This is a story about real witches. And as soon as Miss McLean read those words, I can close my eyes and I'm 9 years old again, and I'm sitting on that carpet and she's reading those words to me, and it's like someone has flicked a switch, like, in my head. Mm-hmm. And for the first time ever, I was in those pages with the characters. Exactly what you were talking about earlier on. I wanted to know what happened next. And when we got to the end of that book, I remember being sort of heartbroken that the story was finished. Even though I knew what happened with the resolution and all that, and we'd got through the book and it was brilliant, I didn't want it to end. It got to the point where I didn't want the bell to ring at the end of the day. I didn't want to go home. I wanted to stay in those pages. And I remember thinking, not the 9-year-old version of me wouldn't have thought about it like this, but looking back on it, I know that I on some level I knew I want to make people feel what I've just felt reading that book. And that's why I started to write, and that's why I still write today. It's all because of that moment.
It's funny that you should pick that bit out of the Witcher's book, because that is the bit that got me. That is it's
really?
when it's not going to be yet another fairy story.
Yes.
It's that I had to read some science fiction once for something that I was studying, and I'd never been a science fiction fan. I didn't want to do it, but then I started reading the books that that I had to do for the course, and the stories that I read that actually gripped me were the ones that weren't science fantasy. They were science fiction, pure science fiction, and it's that element of something that might happen.
Yeah.
So if it's too fantastical, then I don't want to to be involved in it. But if it's something that might happen, it's one of those things that makes you think. And the fact that the Witches of Roald Dahl. Sorry, I'm a bit distracted because there's some questions coming in. Maybe you could develop the story of the Witches and write a follow-up, says Olivia.
I don't think anyone could follow the Witches. I wouldn't even begin to try stepping into Roald Dahl's shoes. He was a complete one-off.
He certainly was.
He was.
Another comment from Olivia that she's definitely going to read this now because your reading has got her gripped, and that's exactly what I found in the book. That it's that getting you gripped.
And you can understand the accent, okay?
I love your accent. So another question then: what do you read now? Do you read books now? What do you read now?
Yeah. I still love to read. My reading tastes are very eclectic, and that's a good word actually. To word of the day: eclectic.
Eclectic. So, it's a nice word.
Things that don't necessarily match, but they go together, somehow. So I mean, my reading tastes are really eclectic. I will read anything. I still read a lot of children's literature. I believe, both classic stuff, but the stuff that's coming out today, is unbelievable. There are so many amazing children's authors out there. From Philip Pullman, who's obviously got his new stuff out, and he's a big name. But there are so many amazing children's authors, and you can walk into any bookshop or any library and just be bowled over by the amount of stuff that's there, and it's good. It's really, really good. So I read a lot of children's books. I read a lot of children's literature, and I'll read, in terms of adult literature, I'll read everything from, like you said, from science fiction through to fantasy. I love Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett was one of my favourite authors ever. Through to Neil Gaiman, Stephen King, and then just sort of general fiction as well, like from, I don't know, I guess there's an author I love from America called Erin Morgenstern, who is really good, and there's just so much stuff out there. I know it's kind of a cop out answer, but I'll read anything. I'll literally read anything.
Do you think it was those type of authors, the Terry Pratchett, Neil Gaiman? Would you say those were your influences?
Yes, absolutely. Terry Pratchett in particular. I mean, when I first started to write, I tried to write like Terry Pratchett. That's most authors, when they start writing, they will try to write like their favourite author. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's how you learn. But over time, you develop your own style, your own voice. So Terry Pratchett was my big hero, but like J.K. Rowling, and latterly, specifically now, Neil Gaiman is just, I think he's a different level to anyone else. His stuff is...
I love Neil Gaiman. Yeah, I love Neil Gaiman's books. Yes. Yeah.
And one of the things that I love about Neil Gaiman's books is something that you mentioned earlier on, Linda, is that most of his stuff falls into the category of it could happen out there. It's set in our world, but it's set in the shadows, and it's set in the places that we don't necessarily see. So it's all things that could be happening out there, and we just don't know about it. And that really appeals to me.
So Amanda is asking, has Ross read Dodger by Terry Pratchett?
I have.
But he'd like this, she says.
Oh, well, I would, he's just one of my all-time heroes. So I've read basically everything he's ever written. And Dodger was one of the first books, along with a book by a guy called, let me get this right. That's terrible. I've totally forgotten his name. Mayhew, Henry Mayhew. He was a Victorian journalist, author, who wrote a book called London Labour and the London Poor. And Henry Mayhew was like I suppose you would call him he was from the sort of upper classes. And he would walk the streets of London and go to the slums and actually speak to these lower classes and speak to toshers and speak to mudlarks, and he would get their stories, and he wrote all these amazing essays about those jobs. So those are the two that really brought the job of tosher to my attention. It was London Labour and the London Poor by Henry Mayhew, which is just amazing. And Dodger was after that. That was another one. So yeah, brilliant.
Now, the bit that you read was quite a scary bit. Was he going to get beaten up by this gang that had got him, and now how she was going to get him away? Though your book is full of love and friendship, we see the way that Joe cares for his grandmother and the way that Lara has a genuine love for Joe, and all that's the heartwarming stuff. But I found bits of the book to be very scary and very dark. So how do you find the right level of darkness to conjure up all that excitement and suspense for children? But it is a children's book. So
yeah,
I started reading some of it. I thought, oh, well, the rats are down the sewer and the gangs that are getting you. It all made me feel a bit, but I think it's an integral part of the book. It is very well balanced with all the heartwarming stuff and all the friendship stuff. But how do you put that right level of darkness into your books?
That's a really good question, actually. I think, first of all, I mean, the heartwarming stuff, I love a book that makes you feel like you're going to meet old friends again. You know what I mean? I love those kind of books. So that just comes out of the kind of books I like to read. In terms of the darkness, I love a scary book too. And I love a scary movie. I love anything with a bit of darkness in it. I don't know what that says about me, but I love all that kind of stuff. So I guess it's just a matter of when I'm writing a book, like when I started to write Evernight, I don't specifically think to myself, okay, I am going to write a book for 9 to 13-year-olds. I write the story that's in my head, the way I think it should be told. And it just so happens that when I start to write, then it sort of becomes clear with the voice of the characters and the age of the characters and the things that happen. Then it becomes clear sort of who I'm writing it for. But the first person I write a book for is myself. So once the darkness starts to seep into it, because that's one of my favorite, I can't lie, that's one of my favorite parts about writing a book is writing the scary bits and writing the bad guys. The bad guys are so much fun to write. But once I know who I'm writing it for, once I've got over that, okay, this is the story I want to write, and it starts to take shape, then I suppose it happens naturally. I don't, some of the stuff in the book could very easily spill over into being an adult book because it is really scary. But I suppose I get in that zone of I know what the story is and I'm familiar with it and I know who it's supposed to be for, and it just sort of happens naturally. But I don't like consciously stick the brakes on and think of really dark stuff and then tone it down because that won't work. It's got to be true to the story as I'm writing it. If that makes sense?
It does make excellent sense. There are two villains, I suppose you would say, in the book. One is Shadow Jack, and the other one is Hester. But those two villains are very different. One is kind of a real villain that I had no patience with and no time for at all. She's just a bad guy.
Yes.
But I did actually feel quite sorry for Shadow Jack. So those two different characters, and the way that I love the way you write the villain's character. Some have got saving graces, some have no saving grace at all. So yeah, that was really exciting. Now, some authors have told us that they've had trouble getting started as authors. They've written loads of books, sent them off, they've been turned down or whatever. So how was it for you? I mean, your books are so brilliant. I can't believe that you'd have any trouble selling them to a publisher.
Again, thank you. You're going to make me blush. I okay, you're going back to 2007. 2007 was when I sent my first book away.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually quite a nice story behind it. I knew I wanted to be a writer by this point. I'd continued to write all through my teenage years, my early 20s. And I told my wife at one point, I really think I could do this, because I'd been reading stuff. I'd been buying, as I'd always read, I'd been buying lots of children's books and reading them and thinking to myself, I could do that. I have ideas in my head and I know that I could do that. So I said to my wife one night, I think I'm going to try and do this. I've started this book and I think it could be a goer. I think it could work. And my wife, because we didn't have a lot of money back then, so my wife said to me, because I was writing on this battered old computer, which was on the verge of just dying, and my wife said to me, "Okay, I'll make you a deal. If I buy you a new laptop, you have to finish the book and send it off to publishers." And that was it. The deal was done, and Aileen, my wife, got me my computer, and I had no choice but to finish the book and send it off. So she believed in me, and it was just that sort of, just that little kick in the right direction that I needed to have the guts to send it off. Mm-hmm. So to answer your question, really long-winded way of answering it, my first book that I sent off was published by.
Excellent.
It climbed out of this, what the publishers call the slush pile, which is anything that they receive that doesn't come from an agent or they haven't asked for goes into this big, huge pile of manuscripts. Most publishers have offices filled with just piles of, or they did back then, because you still sent actual physical paper copies of your book to a publisher. So the slush pile is, it's not a very nice name actually for the stuff that people send in to publishers that hasn't been asked for. It's just people saying, look at my book, I really want you to publish it. And not a lot comes out of the slush pile and makes it onto the shelves in your library or your local bookshop. And my first book was called Zack and the Dream Pirates, and a wonderful guy called Barry Cunningham, who was the guy who discovered J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter. Uh-huh. He was the guy who took me on for his publishing company, Chicken House, and he published Zack and the Dream Pirates way back in 2010. So I am very lucky, very fortunate that I don't have any of those stories of tons of rejection slips, and I know that my story isn't. It's unusual. It's very unusual, because that doesn't usually happen.
So when I introduced the question, then it was right. It was too brilliant for anybody to turn down.
Well,
You were seen as a star right from the beginning.
Yeah. I think I was lucky too. I think I was in the right place at the right time and sent it to the right person. And a lot of writing and becoming an author is it's hard work, but there's a lot of luck involved too. And timing is, like so much in life, timing is everything.
Right place, right time.
Exactly.
Now, I've read a few books, and very famous books, and started reading them, and the book starts to build and starts to build and starts to build, and then goes nowhere. Mm-hmm. Doesn't have a middle, doesn't have an ending. Christina's written in with a question which links into this. Do you find that the endings come easily to you? How do you manage to start the build-up, the main of the story, and then the ending? Do the endings come easy? Do you know the ending?
The ending is something that I will have. That's one of the things. Remember, I said I don't like to plan out too much, but I know certain points I want to hit along the way. The ending is one of those things. I won't have it really set in stone. I won't have it all mapped out, and I won't know exactly what's going to happen, but I will have a rough idea of where I want to get to. And that sort of gives me the confidence to keep going, and it helps me to shape the rest of the book. So with Evernight, I knew roughly, it's a little different. I mean, I give myself space, like I said, to have fun and let the characters evolve and be creative. But for the most part, the ending is something I'll have a rough shape of in my head, and that shape will gradually become clearer as the book goes on. Sometimes it'll end up a different shape. Other times it'll be pretty similar to what I had in my head in the first place. But yeah, the ending's one of those things that I kind of have a rough idea, at least, of where I'm going. And yeah, I kind of go from there.
Do you think as you're coming to the end, do you ever think, "Oh, this is something that I'd like to carry on"? I know there's a sequel to Evernight, and there are 3 in the, Nowhere Emporium, but
Yeah,
the Shadowsmith stands on its own.
yes. Well, what I like to do is the Emporium books stand on their own. Also, I like to write books that. One of the things that really annoys me is just as a reader. I don't think there's anything wrong with actually doing it, but when you get to a book and you get to the end of a book and it leaves you hanging, it's obviously setting up a second book.
Mm,
I like my books to be pretty much self-contained, so they work as a single book, standalone book, but they also work as part of a bigger picture as
yeah.
well. So with Evernight, it's a standalone, but there are elements in that which pop up in the second book. So I have set some things up, but for me, every book has to work on its own and be a standalone book. So you could walk into a bookshop, buy Evernight, and be perfectly happy reading that and know that you don't, that is, the story is finished. That particular story is complete. Lara's story continues,
Mm.
but the story of Evernight that I told in that first book is done.
Is done by the end of it. And
Yeah.
it's interesting what you said about, not wanting the Witchers to finish.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you find a really good book that you're enjoying reading, you page turning, you're reading the book, you're carrying on, you wanting to know what's happened. When it comes to the end, you do feel quite bereft. You think, well,
Oh, yeah.
what am I going to find to read now that's going to
Yeah.
be as good as the one that you've just finished?
I don't know. Absolutely. I don't know about you, but something that I do quite often is as I'm reading a book, um, at the start, I'll be like, oh, yes, I've got all this to go. I've got all this to go. And as
Yeah,
that part starts to get thinner and the part that you've read gets thicker, I read a little bit slower because I don't
you
want
don't want to get to the end.
I don't want it, as that bit gets thinner and thinner, I start to read slower because I start to kind of panic when I get to this sort of stage because I've only got a few pages left, and I feel exactly the same way.
Right, we've had lots of questions. Do you have a second bit that you could read to us?
Yes,
Do you have
I,
a second bit that you could read that we could, and then we'll, I've
absolutely.
just got a few
Yes,
more questions. I'm just looking at the time now. We've got time for a second reading, which would be
no
brilliant.
worries. Let me just read you. You mentioned Shadowjack earlier on,
Hmm.
who you said was the bad guy character who you actually felt a little bit of sympathy for.
I do,
Towards
yeah, I do
the
feel a
end.
bit sorry for him.
So what I'd like to do then is just read you a little bit from the chapter called Shadowjack, right at the very beginning of the book. Now, it's quite a long chapter, so I won't read the entire thing, but I'll just give you a little taste of who Shadowjack is and
Okay,
hopefully this world as well.
okay.
There was a man made of midnight, and his name was Shadowjack. The name suited him well. His clothes were dark, and his hair was darker. His eyes were pools of shadow. As he slipped through the winding labyrinth of the slums on the night our story begins, his intentions were darkest of all. He crossed a wooden bridge to a putrid lump of half-flooded land cut off from the rest of the slums. Filth lay thick on crowded, leaning dwellings, and the rain-swollen river was black as tar and coated with a film of weed and scum. There were few streets or alleys or courts. Mostly there were only waterways and flooded ditches, channels crossing this way and that, with houses built upon crazy-looking wooden stilts to escape the water, which seemed to swell every minute with the storm. This was Devil's Island, and even at such a late hour there were huddles of coats gathered on wooden boats, shifting movements in the darkest corners. They left Shadowjack to his business. He took a deep sniff of the soaking air, searched through the many layers of death and filth and disease. There you are. Cutting down an alley, he came out at the bank of a canal and sniffed again. Somewhere nearby, over the rain, he heard an argument and a fight, and then all was suddenly quiet. Across the waterway, the flicker of a lamp caught his sharp eyes, and a sorry figure stumbled to a glassless window and tipped a bucket of sewage out into the water. Shadowjack made a movement, quick, fluid, and at once he was gone from that spot in the alley, and a black raven the size of an eagle was soaring into the wild night. The raven circled, looked down over the winding waterways and canals and crumbling buildings of Devil's Island, and then it swooped down, coming to rest on the ledge of a high window. The raven hopped into the damp-ridden apartment within. With a sound like dark velvet, it became a man once more, wrapped in his midnight coat. The room was bare, save for a simple bed and a wooden chair under the small window. It seemed, at first glance, that there was no one there, but Shadow Jack heard a heartbeat, fast and frightened. "We both know you're here, Jenny Winter," he said in a low, dangerous voice. "You know what I am. Your tricks won't cut it with me. I hear your heart, hear how frightened you are, and you should be frightened." He stopped, because across the room there was a shimmer in the air, and a woman appeared before his eyes, as if she had been wearing a cloak made from the very fabric of the world, and had slipped it off. Jenny Winter raised a trembling hand. In her fingers she clutched a thin wooden stick, fitted like a pistol with a round of chambers. But instead of bullets, these chambers held small bottles, and inside the bottles were coils of glowing coloured light. Shadow Jack picked a speck off his coat sleeve and examined it before flicking it away. "You can't kill me with magic, you know. 12 of you have tried and failed already." He took a small step towards her, and she raised her wand. The spells glowed fiercely in their bottles. "One more step, and I'll send you through that wall." Shadow Jack turned his eyes skyward. "Look, we both know this journey has come to an end. You're on your own, Jenny. Wherever you go, I'll find you. You've been running so long. You must be exhausted." His voice had taken on a soothing tone. "Imagine how wonderful it would be to be free of the weight you've been carrying. Give me the doomsday spell, Jenny, and it'll all go away." Jenny's thoughts betrayed her. Her hand made an involuntary movement to the place in her coat where she had stowed that most precious of objects. Her eyes met his. Shadow Jack lunged forward. I think we'll leave it there, shall we?
Oh, another cliffhanger. Another cliffhanger. Excellent. The whole book is like that. The whole book just carries you along. Now then, the next part that we do is a challenge. So we usually ask our authors if we have a challenge for children watching out there. Do you have a challenge for us today, Ross?
I absolutely do. And I hope it's a good one. I hope it's one that you'll enjoy. We mentioned earlier, Linda, how I love to write the bad guys, didn't we? Mm-hmm. How it's great fun to create a villain. But one of the things you touched on is really interesting. You said, and we've mentioned it a couple of times now, that you ended up feeling some sympathy for Shadow Jack. Now, no spoilers.
No spoilers.
There's a reason for that. There's a reason why you felt sympathy. It means I've done my job right. And it also means that Shadow Jack isn't just a bad guy. Because when you actually look at life, there are very few people in the real world who are either all bad or all good. Mm-hmm. Everyone has a bad side to them, and everyone has a reason for doing things. So even if you think about it, the most villainous person, to be believable and to be a real person, they must believe that what they are doing, no matter how evil it is, that they are justified in doing that. They must believe that they are correct. Mm-hmm. So what I challenge anyone out there who's watching this to do is to create your own villain and try to have this person be a real, believable, rounded person. So they are not just bad, evil for evil's sake. They have to have a reason for why they are doing what they are doing. So if you create a villain, you can by all means tell us what he or she or it looks like. If it's a monster, if it's a human, it doesn't matter. But concentrate more on the personality, concentrate more on what they want to achieve and why they want to achieve it. And then make sure this villain has a reason for believing that they are right. So they could do horrible things, but they must think they are right. And if you do that, if you create that believable villain, then you can actually play with people's emotions and make them feel sorry for a bad guy. Because
Yeah.
even though
Yeah.
Shadowjack does terrible things in this book, there's a reason he does them.
There is.
So my challenge to you is to create a believable bad guy, a believable villain who does things for a reason and who people might actually feel sorry for when they discover maybe the sad
What's made
story,
them into a villain? Yeah.
what's made
Yeah.
them the way they are. Does that sound
Excellent.
okay?
That sounds like a fantastic challenge. So what we need to do is write these up, if you will. Write up these stories. We want villains. We want different characters. We want why they're a villain. We want what makes them a villain, what makes them believable. And if you could send those into our email address, which is lal@kirklees.gov.uk, and then we'll be able to publish them on our website and see what you've come up with.
Yeah.
So that brings us to 5 minutes before the end. So a huge thank you to Ross for this morning. Good luck with your writing career and also with your graphic design career. We didn't get a chance to talk about that. I could go on talking to you for another hour, but we've only got an hour here. So
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me on. It's been brilliant.
thank you. I look forward to reading The Feast of Evernight, which comes out on the 6th of May next year. Can I just ask, are you happy to stay with us whilst I tell everybody what's happening next week?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yep. Okay. So next week we have Kirsty talking to Catherine Fisher. I think it's Kirsty. It might not be. Talking to Catherine Fisher. Now, Catherine is a poet and a children's author. She lives in South Wales. So we're going from Renfrew in Scotland over to Wales. She'll be talking about the third book in her award-winning Clockwork Crow series, and this is called The Midnight Swan. A first book in the series was The Clockwork Crow, second was The Velvet Fox, and the third one is The Midnight Swan. And in this one, we're going to meet an invisible girl, a parliament of crows, and a pen that writes by itself. So some more mystery there. And the journey of the Midnight Swan might be Siren's most dangerous adventure yet, it said in the blurb. So we'd be interested to see what those adventures are that she gets up to. So don't forget, write it in your diary, write it on the fridge, and log in and watch us next week. Now, this session is next week's session is also a part of the Cosmere Festival. So this Friday, 23rd, we see the start of the Cosmere Festival. This year, it's the second Science Fiction Fantasy Multi-Arts Award Festival. That's a mouthful. With authors, artists, crafts, and other media. And that's all in one place, all in Yorkshire. Kirklees Libraries are delivering the literature strand of Cosmere 2020, and they're doing this via Facebook and via YouTube. So the theme is The End of the World as We Know It. It's exploring the topic of climate change and apocalyptic fiction. Now, it's strange to think that this theme was agreed last year, The End of the World as We Know It, when we didn't know what was going to come this year, but still. So if you want to check out all those events, we've got the Cosmere banner there. So you need to go to www.kirkleeslibraries.co.uk/Cosmere-2020, because those are all the events there. We've got 9 events, 9 days through the Cosmere Festival, and it's all the different authors that the library are going to be talking to. That's our bit, the library bit. So it launches on October 23rd, and there are events every day until the finale on Sunday the 1st. In the meantime, I strongly recommend that you read all of Ross's books. I've already started The Nowhere Emporium, which is this next one, which is the first in the trilogy, and I'm eagerly awaiting next May for The Feast of Evernight. Ross, it's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for this morning. Just talking to you on the telephone before the session, talking to you now, I could talk to you about your books and your experiences forever. You've told us some brilliant things, and I hope that all the children out there are going to have a go at writing the villains. Amanda says that's a really great challenge. Olivia saying she loves the challenge. It's a real thought provoker. So that's what we need, somebody that's already thinking about it.
Excellent. Excellent.
So,
Thank you for having me on. It's been thoroughly enjoyable, and maybe we can do it again sometime.
thank you so much. I would love to talk to you again. Perhaps you could come back and do another one and tell us about the next one, which is the Feast of Evernight.
Yeah, I'm there. I'm there.
I hope everybody watching's enjoyed this as much as I have. Huge thank you for watching. Remember that there will be no fun without an audience. So children, tell your parents about Lal. Parents, teachers, tell all your friends, because we need an audience. We need some classes to sit in. We didn't get any comments from children today, but hopefully we will next time. And thank you so much to Ross. It's just been absolutely brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been fantastic.
Till next time on Libraries Empties Live. Bye for now.